volume is good there. Okay. Welcome to Community Conversations. My name is Courtney Shaw, and I'm the facilitator of the series. Thank you. Before I welcome today's speaker, I want to give an announcement for next week. Next week, we're going to be welcoming Lucas Myers, who will be talking about building an effective sports culture. So please join us again next week for that. And I want to welcome the LCC Library Learning Commons folks, again, here in the back to allow you to check out books on this topic if you are interested in learning more. So today, I want to welcome Geof Richie. Originally from Anchorage, Alaska, Geof Richie came to Longview in 2014 for an internship at a local mental health clinic. He earned his MS in psychology in 2011. He began teaching as an adjunct instructor with LCC in the winter of 2016. And currently, Geof teaches both Psychology 100, General Psychology, and Psychology 200, Lifespan Psychology. In his clinical practice, Geof works with the Wild Heart Society, specializing in LGBTQ care and gender-affirming care. Please welcome Geof Richie.
Good morning, everybody. Thank you for coming out to this conversation today. We're going to talk about something that's a little bit rough because it's on all of our minds. It seems like every single day, every single week, there's new news about gun violence in the US. So we're going to talk about some of the cultural pathways that lead it down the path of violence. We will cover US gun culture. We'll talk about some myths and facts. We'll talk about the pathways to violence model and the warning signs. We'll also talk about a case study and arguments against gun law reform. And I will present my one problem, one solution hypothesis towards the end. So a lot of pushback can come when you're a long-haired college professor in the social sciences. When people say, well, do you even know the difference between an automatic and a semi-automatic, or a wheel gun or a revolver, or what a cartridge is, or et cetera, et cetera. And yes, first of all, as you heard earlier, I was raised in Alaska. Now I should be able to stop there. But I'll continue. My father was first in the Army and then in the Army Guard. He was an NRA member. Rifleman magazine came to our house frequently, and I loved to page through them. When I was 7 years old, I shot my first long gun. It was a .22 long rifle made for target shooting. And I fired my first handgun at the age of 12. It was a 9mm semi-automatic. No, it was a .357 Magnum. Oh, funny story. So Dad would have me shoot 38 specials out of the .357 Magnum. So I was, plink, plink, plink. But then one day he said, okay, I'm going to load one .357 Magnum in, and the rest will be 38 specials. See if you can tell the difference. And I was like, plink, plink. I think that was the one. I had my concealed carry permit at the age of 19, and I carried concealed for work when I was responsible for taking large cash deposits to the bank. And after what happened in Aurora, I also carried concealed when I went to the movie theaters. So where I got this information, so that you know I'm not making this up. First of all, there's a NetCE course. It's an online continuing education site. The course is called Mass Shooters and Murderers, Motives and Paths, course number 76430. And that was put together by Mark Rose, the faculty. He compiled 253 peer-reviewed sources for that. Don't take my word for it. Go find it, look it up yourself. If you don't want to pay for it, then you can search any of these topics on scholar.google.com. Other sources that I'll use for today's presentation include the Center for Inquiry, Arming America, The Origins of a National Gun Culture by Michael Belisiles, Medium, an article by Dr. Ryan Hubbard, The Hill, NPR, The Reload, Gallup, and ABC News. So, US gun culture. First of all, when we think about US gun culture, we think about all kinds of things. What comes to mind for you when you hear US gun culture? Killings, okay. The NRA. Hunting, yeah, okay. Sorry? Gang violence, yeah, and shooting, okay. Nobody said the Old West. Oh, did you say Old West? Okay, right, yeah. And that sort of stuff. Well, as it turns out, the Second Amendment, of course, was written when guns took at least half a minute to reload. And of course, we know that today that we can fire round after round just by pulling the trigger again and again, or if you make a certain modification, you just have to hold the trigger down. Pioneers in America, as we expanded westward in our colonization and genocide of indigenous people, mostly trapped and farmed. They didn't use a lot of firearms for hunting. So gun ownership in the early US was a small percentage. You know, perhaps the stagecoach driver might have had a rifle with him, but the people in the stagecoach generally weren't armed. We have this glorification of the Wild West that we have seen in theater and film and television all throughout the 20th century, which sort of, paints the white European colonizer with the cowboy hat as the good guy and paints the indigenous people as savages that needed to be conquered and civilized. We have a militia mentality in the United States. It's paramilitary organizations that set up shop, stockpile firearms, and do their own sort of paramilitary training. And this is supposed to be for protection from a tyrannical government, which is what the Second Amendment was all about when it was written, but it wouldn't work in modern times. More on that later. So let's define mass shootings. This information comes from Center for Inquiry, and a mass shooting is defined as 3 or more people shot. 3 or more, okay? And there's different types of mass shootings. The first and the most common type of mass shooting is a family-side. In fact, we had an instance of this just a couple of weeks ago, somewhere in northeastern continental US, but I don't remember where exactly. This is typically where you have a close relationship with the victim and the offender, and it's typically carried out by white middle-aged males, some sort of slight loss of status or whatnot, and they decide to take out their children, their wife, and themselves. We have felony killings, which are distinguished from family-sides by motives. Felony killings generally is used to achieve some primary criminal objective, some kind of financial gain or territory war, something like that. It's the second largest category of mass murder. And it's typically, the perpetrators tend to be young Black or Hispanic males with criminal backgrounds. And then neither family-sides nor felony killings receive very much media attention, perhaps because they're too commonplace or they're not sensational enough. It's just wallpaper to us. Most deadly violence occurs between people who know each other. So oftentimes I hear in counter-arguments for gun reform that we have to address the Black-on-Black crime problem. Well, if indeed most deadly violence occurs between people who know each other, of course we're going to have Black-on-Black crime, we're going to have Asian-on-Asian crime, we're going to have white-on-white crime, and have Indigenous-on-Indigenous crime, right? So that's no surprise, and it's not a great argument. Public mass shootings, now this is what we're most concerned about, right? This is what gets all of the media attention. So that's what we're going to focus on today. There's extreme visibility, but it is the smallest proportion of mass murders that do take place. It's distinguished by attack location. These attacks are carried out in schools, churches, shopping malls, Walmarts, concerts, nightclubs, and public holiday celebrations, anywhere where there's large gatherings of people. The perpetrators are a heterogeneous group, meaning that there's a difference in them. However, they're typically stereotyped as young or middle-aged white males. And the reason for that is because most of them are perpetrated by white males. 49% of public mass shootings, Black males account for 31%, and other races account for 19%. As of this year, you may have heard that the #1 cause of death for children in the United States is firearms. That's above cancer, that's above car crashes, that's above influenza or COVID or household accidents or any other cause. Here's some myths to talk about. #1, the perpetrator snapped. Mass shootings, public mass shootings tend to be a form of instrumental or primary violence, and as opposed to reactive violence. So they tend to be cold, calculated, well planned out, And the pathway to getting there is a protracted period of time. It's not an instantaneous decision. The perpetrator must have been Muslim. Well, we saw from the previous slide that that's usually not the case. There's a couple of examples. Remember the Pulse nightclub shooting? Remember the San Jose shootings were Muslim perpetrators. But by far, the Islamic extremist violence is infrequent in the US compared to other extremist groups. The assailant must have been mentally ill. We'll get into this a little more later, but not even close. And even when they were, the symptoms weren't the motive for conducting the crime. Mass shootings are just a fact of life that we have to deal with. Well, I refuse. I think that, the research shows us that we can't predict this kind of violence, but we can prevent it. And we'll talk about prevention when we get to our case study later on. Psychiatric disorders are not tied to mass shootings. Serious mental illness like schizophrenia, psychosis, bipolar disorder, and severe major depression can increase the harm to self and others, but especially if substances have been used. But this excludes non-suicidal deaths and mass shootings, right? So typically there's going to be like some fisticuffs involved. However, people with severe mental illness are not more violent than people without psychiatric conditions. In fact, mass shootings committed during episodes of serious mental illness are extremely rare. And people with serious mental illness commit less than 3% of all violence, so less than the general population on average. Substance use disorders. As we have found that mass shooters rarely use substances. There were two notable exceptions, in which case they found that substances had been used prior to carrying out the act, but they were therapeutic amounts, like normal doses of a sedating medication such as Xanax or alprazolam, in order to steady their nerves for what they were about to do. Other forms of violence, especially domestic violence, often involve substance use, and they're typically more reactive in nature rather than instrumental. So let's talk about the difference between instrumental and reactive violence. Instrumental aggression is primary. It's cold and calculated. It's planned in advance. It is usually very organized. And here's some examples. It can be either physical or social. Rob wants Steve's new TV. Rob carefully plans to break into Steve's home while he is away and take his TV. Right? That would be an instrumental aggression. Susie wants her boss's job. Susie begins spreading rumors that her boss is having an affair. Right? Another form of instrumental or primary aggression, in this case, social. Daniel wants to stop abortions. He plans out the shooting of several doctors who provide termination services. Again, instrumental, primary, cold, calculated, planned in advance. Reactive aggression is secondary. It tends to be hot and impulsive. It tends to always usually be physical. Here are some examples. Steve finds out that Rob stole his TV, so he slashes Rob's tires. I take Teresa's mug away from her, so she kicks me in the groin. Gary has been drinking at his favorite bar when another man starts making moves on Gary's crush. Gary goes out to his car to get his gun, comes back in and shoots the guy. All right, this is reactive violence, secondary to some sort of perceived slight. The key ingredients in extreme overvalued belief is the very first thing that comes into play. Now, the belief is not delusional, meaning that it doesn't strictly meet the definition of delusion in our diagnostic criteria because it is culturally held by other people, even though it may be wrong. It's shared by others in a subcultural group. The belief is rigidly held and it is defended and becomes more dominant and refined and resistant to challenges, especially in today's day and age where we have information silos that are created by social media algorithms. Paranoia is another key ingredient we find when people commit mass shootings. So they have a strong belief, and then they have some sort of a paranoid part of their personality as well. They feel a sense of insecurity or inferiority. They perceive injustices, some slights against themselves. They want to find some way to get payback. Some cultural influences for this. There's a culture of celebrity narcissism and perverse incentive when it comes to this. People have developed the idea that that there's one way to get their point across and that it will really make an impact. We say that the media coverage turned mass killers into celebrities. During the month of the attack, some killers received more high-value media coverage than some of the most famous American celebrities. Contagion, Copycat, and Columbine as a cultural script. So it's a socially contagious idea, especially within the information silos that I mentioned. Cultural script is a schema or prescription for behavior. So think about your cultural script for going to the movies, right? That probably involves today using your phone to buy tickets online and then showing up at the theater a little bit in advance, getting some snacks, having your ticket checked, going in and finding your seats. And if you're with me, we better make it for the previews. The script of mass shootings points to armed attacks as a model for problem solving, a quote, masculine solution that changes the perpetrator's perceived reputation from a socially marginalized individual to a notorious anti-hero. Suspects have planned attacks on Columbine's anniversaries and sought to outdo the body count, using that as a cultural script. Violent video game consumption. Some studies show that exposure to violent media can increase aggressive behaviors. Other studies show that there's no connection between consumption of violent media and aggressive behaviors. Most video game players do not commit mass violence. That's good to know, because we know a lot of people that play video games, don't we? Most mass shooters have no documented history of violent video game consumption, except as a tactical rehearsal before the event, but not up until that point. Hegemonic masculinity. Hegemonic is a 50-cent word for toxic. And it's a masculinity. Masculinity is fluid. It has many different expressions within and between cultures. Like mushrooms, not all masculinities are toxic, but some are. Hegemonic or toxic masculinity has no clinical definition, but it is generally defined as a set of values established by men in power that functions to organize society in gender unequal ways. It combines several features, a hierarchy of masculinities. We hear people like Andrew Tate talking about being alpha males, for example. A differential access among men to power over women and other men, and the interplay between men's identities, men's ideals, interactions, power, and patriarchy. Okay, we're talking about two models applied to mass shooters. First is the pathways to violence model. In this model, there are several steps. First, there's a grievance, and then there's ideation, and then there's research and planning, and then preparation. There's sometimes a breach, and then the attack. Stage one, grievance. A perceived injustice, threat, or loss of high personal significance. The cause of the offender's distress or resentment. I think we pointed to bullying as a primary motivator for Columbine, and in some other cases as well. Perception of having been wronged or treated unfairly. Externalizing blame, which creates a target, right? It's not my fault, it's you. You did it to me, right? It's more than anger. It's kind of a sense of righteous indignation, a mission that has to be fulfilled. It's exacerbated by narcissistic personality traits and self-entitlement and also privilege. A conclusion is reached that relief can only come through violent fantasy. It's important to note that not all who are aggrieved progress to committing violence. Stage two is ideation. This is unable to find relief outside of violent fantasy. A decision is made. And a pseudo-commander warrior mentality inflames grandiosity. We find so many of these shooters after the fact. We search their homes and we find that they have all kinds of tactical gear and manuals on tactical tactics and sort of paramilitary mentality. Revenge fantasies become inflexible and persistent during the ideation stage. And the focus goes to previous attacks or attackers and their notoriety. Not all who advance to ideation proceed. Some settle into fantasy retribution. I do a lot of fantasy retribution myself too, especially when I'm driving on the freeway, right? You know, somebody will buzz by. I'm trying to give the semi enough room before I come over, and somebody buzzes in and cuts them off. And I'm thinking, okay, I'll just put a ball of blue energy around them and they'll get pulled over. It's my fantasy retribution, as it were. Others become so enthralled by the sense of relief with violent fantasy that they lose the desire to seek nonviolent resolutions. Stage 3 is research and planning. During research and planning, this bridges the gap between ideation and action. The concrete steps are taken towards an attack. These steps might include planning out, looking at the blueprints of a building or the layout of the public square or things like that. Efforts are dedicated towards the goal, gathering information about the target or targets, as it were. Stalking the target is another piece that occurs during research and planning, trying to figure out when they're going to be all in one place or where they're going to be, et cetera, at a given time. Photographing targeted areas or sort of casing them out is part of the research and planning phase. Internet searches and communication with like-minded people happens during this stage as well. Again, those information silos fed by social media algorithms. Stage 4 is preparation. During preparation, they may start accumulating the necessary weapons and ammunition, collecting tactical clothing or other practical materials, confirming transportation routes, rehearsal of the attack. This is where video games may be used. Psychological preparation, amping themselves up for what it is they're going to do. Stage 5 is a breach. A breach can be a couple of different things. First of all, it has to do with assessing the level of security, right? And figuring out how to get close to the target in an area. There may be a dry run by intruding into a facility to identify security measures. Sometimes they may even smuggle weapons into the target area beforehand and dressing as security or delivery personnel to gain non-forceful entry. Stage 6 is the attack, a destructive, nihilistic assault. Domination of the targeted institution, group, or individual. Two desired states that we find for people who are carrying out these attacks. One is the perceived infamy and notoriety from the inevitable media coverage. And the other is a sense of omnipotent, albeit transient, control. They may realize that their actions will lead to their ultimate arrest or even death. And they have a fleeting experience of control, which is perceived as transformative. So the other model is the warning behaviors model, right? We'll talk about proximal behaviors, any behavior from the pathways to violence model. Fixation, identification, the warrior mindset, a novel aggression, and an energy burst, leakage, and directly communicated threat. And then the last resort. So pathway behaviors are basically any behaviors from the pathways to violence model that we just went over. Research, planning, preparation, breach, implementation. Fixation is an extreme preoccupation with another person, activity, and idea, often involving the grievance to the personal cause. There's increasing perseveration on persons or causes. There's an increasing negative characterization of the person or causes. There's an angry emotional undertone. There's impact on the family or associates of the object of the fixation. I was just watching one of those Explore With Us videos the other day about a high school, I think it was a football captain who, or wide receiver, and his girlfriend, he was kind of abusing his girlfriend in the relationship that he had with the lead cheerleader. And she finally rebuked him, and then he carried out active instrumental aggression. But before it happened, there was an impact on the people around her, such that the parents didn't want him coming around the house anymore, that she stuck with groups of friends and avoided him, and things like that. There's a social and occupational deterioration, right? So people will become more isolated, they'll become less social, they'll miss work, or they'll perform poorly on the job. Identification. This is the identification of the individual. It tends to be a warrior mentality, a desire to be that pseudo commando, the militia type, right? Gathering tactical gear. Perhaps they even fantasize about going into the military or joining the police force. They may even work in security. Identification with military and law enforcement, right? So they like military and law enforcement weapons, uniforms, paraphernalia, and they study the tactics. They study previous attackers and their tactics. They identify as self-proclaimed agents to advance a cause or belief system. Remember in Texas, when the Walmart shooting occurred, the motivation from the shooter was that he wanted to stop Latin immigrants from coming across the border and, stealing our jobs and replacing us in that sense. A novel aggression is a new behavior, something that hasn't been seen before. It appears unrelated to any pathway behavior, and it occurs for the first time. So lashing out at a friend or a partner or a family member, it tests the perpetrator's ability to become violent. Okay, I can actually shove them down. That means that I can go ahead and proceed. It's sort of an experimental aggression in that way. Not unlike the eventual serial killer who progressed from small animals to large animals to people. That trope. There's an energy burst where warning behaviors increase in frequency, duration, and variety. It's related to the target, and it may seem innocuous. In fact, taking pictures out in public, maybe you like the way that bridge looks, right? A leakage, and this played into the case study that we'll talk about. This is when intentions or plans of violence are expressed to another person or posted on the internet. One of the strongest warning behaviors. If somebody sends out a message to their classmates that they need, to certain classmates that they need to stay home from school tomorrow, that's a big red flag. If somebody says, everybody's going to be surprised, or watch for the headlines or something like that. Those are things that can be leakages of the intent. It's nearly ubiquitous across all groups of offenders. At some point, they're going to either confide in somebody personally, or they're going to make some kind of a public statement. The grievance is strongly associated with the leakage. So when they give that information, they'll be talking about what it is that they feel is the perceived slight in the situation. In most school shootings, at least one person knew the killer's intention before it happened. So if you hear something, say something, right? Numerous shootings have been prevented by reporting leaks. Directly communicated threat is when some attackers use unambiguously stated or written threats. I'm going to shoot up the concert. I'm going to kill a lot of people. Either to the target or to law enforcement. They may threaten directly to the to the target, the school, the church, the institution, or to law enforcement, letting them kind of in on what's going to happen. There's an increased risk in cases of current or past sexual partners. So we see a lot of that direct violence, in the example I talked about, a young wide receiver and his lead cheerleader girlfriend. Of course, she was an ex-sexual partner. He felt slighted by that, decided that if he couldn't have her, nobody was going to. Rare cases of targeted violence. It's rare in cases of targeted violence where we're going after a specific individual. And then the last resort. The last resort is communications or actions indicating a violent action imperative, increasing desperation or distress. We can see this in individuals as they ramp up and come to the place where they're going to implement their plan. There's indications that the perpetrator has been forced into it in the way that they express their distress or desperation. Again, it's the inability to see nonviolent solutions and feeling like this is the only way that they can get their point across. No alternative to violence is perceived at this point. Perpetrator believes that the consequences are justified. So I'll rot in prison for the rest of my life. So I'll get killed by the police. At least I will have done something meaningful and gotten my point across. They feel trapped. They feel isolated. There are some similarities between far-right extremists and Islamic extremists. The radicalization pathways are remarkably similar. It begins, of course, with a grievance, and then getting into the ideation and the information silos and being radicalized by other people. Issues at the margins of society similarly affect young people. A lot of young folks today are looking at the real estate market and wondering if they're ever going to be able to own a home, or the job market and wondering if they're ever going to be able to have a stable career. Globalization leaves communities with a sense of isolation. So the more we globalize, the more sort of insular and individual communities feel like they're left behind because they're not being taken into account because we're looking at the big picture. The left behind groups of both white working class and Muslim minorities face social, psychological, economic, and structural issues, right? The diversification of the workforce, for example. Again, this is the perception of marginalization, as in white replacement theory, the idea that, that white people will be replaced by other groups of people going forward. We're still the largest racial demographic. We estimate by 2040, I think, that we'll be the largest among minorities, but we'll still, again, be the largest demographic. Thwarted formation of identities or realization of personal potential, right? I couldn't get into that college because they were racist against white people, or they were discriminating against me because I was Muslim. An inability to find work. Also, I thought that I was going to be able to go into a profession that doesn't have room for me. There's a crisis of masculinity created by a lack of social mobility. We don't have much of an ability to change socioeconomic statuses in the US, and definitely in the Eastern or Middle Eastern Muslim countries where poverty is rampant. When privilege is the norm, equality can be perceived as oppression. Again, that diversification of the workforce or hiring quotas for affirmative action can be seen as marginalizing the group who is dominant. However, white Christians are still the dominant group in the United States, and Christians in general is the largest religious group in the entire world with some 2 billion members worldwide. And Islam is the second largest with some 1 billion members worldwide. So here's a case study. This happened locally. There was a case at a local high school where a leakage was reported by a peer. In this case, it was a list that was found on the individual's personal tablet. The electronics were confiscated and searched. They found a plan, a list, and a video game, which you can still download from the Play Store on Google, called School Shooter. The threat assessment, so we assessed the threats, we isolated the individual, and we got them into mental health treatment. The contributing factors here were parental alienation in a custody battle based on a conservative Christian worldview. And the protective factor was this individual had no access to firearms. So between the mental health treatment and no access to firearms, the individual has since successfully graduated and is now a productive member of our community. The solution. What is the solution? There are certainly cultural issues that must be reduced and must be addressed in reducing mass violence. Access to personal potential, right? The feeling that we can achieve a life worth living within the system that is available for us. Isolation of fundamentalist ideologies. So people who have those fundamentalist ideologies tend to be insular in their groups and their associations, again, information silos and echo chambers. Inflammatory rhetoric. Boy, golly, we in social science have come to identify one particular thing known as the Trump effect, where in 2015, Trump started running for president, and he got out there and he started saying things like, you know, whatever it was that incited violence at his rallies and got people's blood boiling. And in response, we who do treatment began hearing from our patients that there was an increase in pejorative language, threatening language, bullying, and that sort of thing. Gun culture and access to guns, right? The idea of guns being an inherent part of American society and our easy access to them. There are still places where you can go and purchase a gun for cash same day, no background check, no waiting period. The United States stands alone compared to other industrialized nations in this manner. So here's a statement from the APA CEO. I'll try to get through this as fast as I can. It says, blaming mental illness for gun violence in our country is simplistic and inaccurate and goes against the scientific evidence currently available. The United States is a global outlier when it comes to horrific headlines like the ones that consumed us all weekend. This was in response to a shooting that happened a few years ago. Although the United States makes up less than 5% of the world's population, we are home to 31% of all mass shooters globally, according to a CNN analysis. This difference is not explained by the rate of mental illness in the United States. The one stark difference is access to guns. Americans own nearly half the estimated 650 million civilian-owned guns in the world. Access to this final fatal tool means more deaths that occur more quickly, whether in a mass shooting or in someone's own home. As we psychological scientists have said repeatedly, the overwhelming majority of people with mental illness are not violent. And there's no single personality profile that can reliably predict who will resort to gun violence. Based on the research, we know that only a history of violence is the single best predictor of who will commit future violence. But of course, as we saw earlier, the novel aggression might be the first instance of somebody in this case. And access to more guns, deadlier guns, means more lives lost. Based on the psychological science, we know some of the steps we need to take. We need to limit civilians' access to assault weapons and high-capacity magazines. We need to institute universal background checks, and we should institute red flag laws that remove guns from people who are at high risk of committing violent acts. And although the president called on the nation to do a better job of identifying and acting on early warning signs, that requires research to ensure that we are making decisions based on data, not prejudices and fear. We agree with the president's call to strengthen background checks, but this falls woefully short of what is needed. We must take a comprehensive public health approach and provide prevention and the National Institutes of Health to better understand, and provide dedicated federal funding to agencies, including Centers for Disease Control and Prevention and the National Institute of Health, to better understand the causing contributing factors and solution to gun violence. The Centers for Disease Control is still prohibited from studying gun violence by federal law. The president clearly said that it's time to stop the hateful rhetoric that is infecting the public discourse. We ask that he use his powerful position to model that behavior, and we ask that the federal government support the research needed to better understand the causes of bigotry and hate and their association to violence so that we may devise evidence-based solutions. The weapons effect is a well-studied psychological phenomenon. Basically, the presence of a weapon increases aggressive responses to provocation, simply having it in the room. The mere presence of the weapon increases aggression. Presence of a weapon increases aggressive thoughts and hostile appraisals. Whether concealed or not, for example, most motorists who with concealed weapons drive more aggressively than motorists without weapons. It's just the presence. So here's some objections, the pushback, the arguments against gun law reform. First of all, guns don't kill people, people kill people. But as the comedian Eddie Izzard told us, I think the gun helps. Right? You know, it's very hard to kill somebody by going bang, bang, rah-da-da, rah-da. You have to be kind of dodgy on the heart. You know? If you outlaw guns, only outlaws will have guns. Have you heard this one? Yeah, this is basically an argument against all laws everywhere, right? If theft, DUI, rape, murder, people are going to do it anyway. Why outlaw it? I don't want the government controlling me. Okay. Well, fatal car crashes before and after seatbelt laws. Look it up. Decide whether or not that was a good move. It's my right as an American, and it shall not be infringed. They love that part, but they reel at the suggestion of well-regulated. They often bring up the Swiss model as well. Switzerland has one of the highest rates of gun ownership. It has nearly zero gun violence, 0.002%. Well, they also have compulsory service with comprehensive firearms training. Every man has to be in the military for 2 years in Switzerland. You have to make an application with the police before you can own your firearm. You have to have justification for gun ownership. And that justification could be as simple as I like to target shoot, right? You have to have a criminal background check showing 0 convictions. There's a segment on The Daily Show where one of the correspondents went to Switzerland and was talking with a Swiss firearms instructor, and he was talking about this particular piece. And he says, well, what if it's a small crime, like urinating in public or something like that? And the guy says very, wisely, well, if I can't trust you to follow simple rules of society, why should you have a gun? Mandatory safe storage procedures. You cannot carry around a loaded weapon. You cannot store a loaded weapon. You have to keep the ammunition separate. You get to the firing range where you're going to target shoot, and you're not allowed to put the bullet in the gun until you are ready to shoot it. There was one instance of mass shooting in 2001 at Parliament in Switzerland, and they immediately tightened their gun laws, and they haven't had a mass shooting since. Yeah, the laws were immediately strengthened. The Chicago argument, this is another one. They say that Chicago has the strictest gun regulations of any city, county, or state jurisdiction, but has a high prevalence of gun violence. Well, first of all, it's not true. Gun laws have been watered down in Chicago due to Supreme Court rulings and state laws on concealed carry permits. It's actually California that has the strongest gun laws in the United States. Chicago is not an insular jurisdiction with closed borders. It has neighboring states where gun laws may be weaker, in particular, Wisconsin and Indiana. Here's a fact to remember. If you own a firearm, that firearm is more likely to hurt you or someone you love than it ever is to save your life in a situation where you have it with you. That's worth repeating. If you own a firearm, the likelihood that it will hurt you or someone you love is far greater than the chances that it will ever save your life in a given situation. Majority opinion. Well, it's tempting to think that there's a large majority of people who oppose common sense gun regulations. That's because the group is very loud and overrepresented in Congress. In fact, 88% of people polled, both Democrat and Republican, favor universal background checks. 77% favor red flag laws. 51% favor an assault weapons ban. 70% favor registering firearms with the police. Most Americans favor closing the gun show loophole, right? All of these common sense things that have been suggested and passed around in rhetoric and political campaigns for a long time, but still no action in Congress. Because again, the group that believes that their rights shall not be infringed without the well-regulated part is overrepresented in Congress. There was another proposal that Dorothy Gaskey made when she was running for state rep, or no, congressional third. I think she was running against Jamie Herrera Butler a few years ago. And her suggestion, which is something that they do in some other countries, was to put serial numbers on ammunition, so that when you find the expended ammunition, you can tell where it was sold and to whom. So my hypothesis is that when there's one problem, there needs to be one solution. We tend to overcomplicate things instead of looking to solutions that are staring us right in the face. For example, climate change. We need to stop putting carbon in the atmosphere, right? There's too much carbon up there. We need to stop putting it there. We need to find a way to get some of it back down. That's the solution. Homelessness. Provide housing. Make housing a guaranteed right for everybody. It doesn't mean you have to live in the guaranteed housing. If you can afford it, you can live somewhere else. This is what they did in Sweden, and their homeless population is down to 0.001%. Gun violence. Reduce access to deadly firearms. That's it. Access to deadly firearms is the single #1 factor in all of these gun violence instances. My thesis here is that the Second Amendment should be interpreted so that the right to bear arms shall not be infringed after meeting the regulations previously mentioned in the amendment. Perhaps it should be rewritten to clarify this meaning. That would take a constitutional convention. Okay. Questions, comments? Yes, sir.
I'm coming with the mic.
Oh, I don't need that. Oh. Yeah, I have a question about the Second Amendment and the way it is perceived. Because the way I read it, the wording about the well-regulated militia being necessary to preserve a free state is more a reference to the fact that we gained our independence through well-armed militias, not just a continental military, that we depended on citizen soldiers to help us fight off a tyrannical king government. And the way the Constitution's written, if we've got a bad leader, we vote him out. I mean, we have a way to deal with tyrannical government thanks to the Constitution. I just think that part is so misread and misunderstood that people think it grants them carte blanche to own a weapon to overthrow our own government. And I don't think that was the purpose of the statement in the first place.
Nor is it even possible. All right. I don't care how many 50 caliber automatic machine guns you have stockpiled in your paramilitary institution. It's not going to make a lick of difference when they shoot a Tomahawk missile at you. Right. Also, the Second Amendment, again, was written at a time when reloading a gun took at least half a minute. And things have changed since then. People talk about regulations with driver's licenses. You have to be able to pass a test to show that you can drive the car safely. Well, that's not a constitutionally guaranteed right, but automobiles weren't around when the Constitution were written. Would it have been if they were?
Hey, Jeff, great presentation.
Thank you.
Fellow adjunct, Chris Tower, teaching in Lang Lit. I was going to ask a question very much related to this gentleman's question about the fact that the word militia is very explicitly in the Second Amendment. So very much like Switzerland, what you're thinking on whether we should make it so that participation and membership in a militia is a requirement of gun ownership.
Yeah, and that is the main justification that Switzerland has for having an armed populace, is to protect themselves from invasion, right? They don't have to do a draft. They don't have to get anybody in the military. Everybody's got a rifle at home. They already have the training for it, right? And it's a good thing, because the last time Switzerland was invaded was 1896.
I have a question, and a lot of the future gun laws people are presenting, I agree. There's a lot of things that should happen. That doesn't stop what's happening right now. How do we get the current? There's like 300 million guns on the street today, and some of them are in a lot of bad people. How do we get the guns away from those people? What would you suggest? How do we go take them away? Are you in favor of taking guns away from people?
Well, if somebody shouldn't have one, right, because of a red flag law or something like that, then yes. Right. In fact, in Washington State, we have a contingent for domestic violence cases where if you have a perpetrator of domestic violence, the victim can petition to have their gun rights removed. The police will come and take it from you.
Well, that person, if it's a domestic violence, are they going to go against the person? You know, unfortunately, people, I'm too much in love with him or her. Society needs to go take guns away. I've heard a suggestion that every gun crime is a federal crime. Federal laws take over. There's going to be one law, you know, instead of having these, you know, how many different laws across the country.
Yeah, I worry about the current makeup of the Supreme Court deciding how those federal laws are enforced. One thing that I can tell you
Eric
about
Reed caused that. So that's, you know,
one thing that I can tell you about getting guns off of the streets, and this is well documented. You can look it up. Federal gun buyback programs work. Right? You offer up people money more than what their weapon is worth, they'll bring it in and sell it to you. They want the cash.
Thank you very much. Thanks for all of your great questions. And thank you to Geof Richie for the presentation. Please join us again next week.